So let's talk watching television. Now, watching television had a whole nother meaning back in the 70s and 80s. It was a completely different experience. It was more communal, it was limited, and it was ritualistic. But the most important part was it was deeply memorable. So here's a snapshot of what it was like. So back in the 70s, we typically had one TV in the house. Usually it was in the family room or living room. The screens were not very big at all. They were curved. Some of the screens had almost a green tint to them. My own family TV in the living room was a big console TV, and so it sat really low to the ground. So if you really wanted to see what was on the screen, and especially as a child, you sat on the floor up close to the TV, which of course our parents told us would make us go blind if we did that too often. Spoiler alert, I did not go blind. So we used something called TV antennas. So the channels that we got were either UHF or VHF, meaning they were over-the-air channels. UHF was ultra-high frequency, and VHF was very high frequency. So typically we had three main stations on the UHF channel. We had the three major networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And then if we switched over to VHF, sometimes we were able to get in like a local PBS station. And typically the numbers on the dial were higher up. So for example, my local PBS station was channel 21. But let me tell you, watching TV was a planned event. Families planned when to watch TV and what to watch. And when I say they were events, what I mean is it was very purposefully planned. At 7 o'clock on Saturday night, the family gathered around the TV to watch a certain show. And then maybe after that, another certain show. Everybody sat in their designated spots. Sometimes we had snacks like popcorn, and it was a big deal. Nobody did anything else during this time. Nobody took phone calls. We barely even spoke to each other. We were just glued to the TV. So let's go back to how we got channels in. So a couple of things. This is before cable TV. This is really before satellite dishes like Dish Network or something like that. So we had what was called rabbit ears on top of our TV. And that was just kind of the first step. So basically it was like a V-shaped antenna that looked like rabbit ears, and you would pull them up and you would have to move them around to make sure that whatever station you had on was coming in. Now, it never guaranteed crystal clarity. There was surely to be interruptions. There was surely to be a little static and a little graininess. But if you could get the channel to mostly come in, then it was a good day. Now, serious, diehard, let's say fathers, back in the 70s and 80s, would go to Radio Shack and purchase these huge monstrosity antennas that they would mount on the highest point of the roof. So if you had a two-story house, you were really in luck, because that meant you could maybe get even more channels. If you had a one-story house that had a chimney, you likely would mount that antenna on top of or very close to the chimney. So by getting to the highest point, you guaranteed a better reception. I'm pretty sure we had an on-the-roof antenna at some point, and I'm sure my dad was up on the roof scaring my mom half to death, tinkering with the antenna. All right, so in terms of what to watch, the kids really never had much of a choice, unless it was a very specific event. Around the holiday times, there were very specific TV events that we waited all year for. For example, when they showed Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, or A Charlie Brown Christmas, or The Wizard of Oz. That was a huge one in my family. And also The Sound of Music. But during the week and when these non-events occurred, the parents chose what TV shows to watch. So whatever adult show they were watching, whether it be Dallas or Falcon Crest or Fantasy Island, that is what our parents chose to watch. And we just sat and watched along with them. And yes, that included, in my case, Hee Haw and Lawrence Welk and 60 Minutes. Ugh. But I sat there and watched it right along with them. I had no idea what was going on, but we were together as a family and we were watching something together. There was no streaming. There was no on-demand. And like I said before, it was very purposeful and considered a family moment. Another interesting thing is we also had no remote controls. I'm sure that there were TVs out there in the 70s that did have remote controls, But I would bet that most of us growing up did not have a remote until much later. So, what did that mean? That meant that us kids were the remote controls. And since we only had 3 to 5 channels and we were sitting so close to the TV, it was not a big deal when our parents said, "Would you change the channel?" And we got up, went to the channel, and went and changed it. And if nothing good was on, then we changed it again. So let's talk commercials. So commercials were a part of the experience. You couldn't skip them, you couldn't pause, you couldn't fast forward. Commercials were super memorable back then. For example, "I'd like to buy the world a Coke," or "Where's the beef?" And I'm sure there are many more commercials that totally stick in our head and remind us of our childhood and our youth. So when a commercial came on, we either sat there and watched it as another form of entertainment, or we used that time to go to the bathroom or get a snack. It was just part of the whole experience. Another interesting tidbit is everyone, at least in the United States, we all watched the same shows because, again, there was limited options. So everybody knew what was going on Happy Days. They knew what was going on The Cosby Show, on Cheers, on MASH. And then when a show had a huge monumental event like Who Shot JR? That was the topic of conversation at work or school the next day. Although when I was in school, I wasn't really talking about who shot JR. Nonetheless, people gathered around the water cooler to talk about these monumental TV events and then had to wait many, many months for the season to start up again to find out who actually shot JR. I actually have no idea who shot JR. I never watched that show. So if you know who shot JR, put it in the comments below. Eventually, when the 80s came along, so did cable boxes. Now, these were boxes that had several push buttons on it that were very clicky, and the local cable company came out and hooked up your cable dish, had to drill holes in walls, put in different cables, and it was a very exciting time. Of course, for me, the only channel I cared about was MTV. And I've talked about this many, many times, but I think it was in 1984 when we finally got cable. And whenever my parents weren't home, which was a lot because they were working, I had MTV on. This was also about the time when HBO came on the scene. Now, as a kid, we never, ever had HBO. And I think I had a friend down the street who had it. And I always thought HBO was for viewing rated R movies, which I wasn't allowed to go to. My parents did not take me to rated R movies. So if I was over at my friend's house and she had HBO on, I was secretly looking to see if there was some movie on that I wasn't allowed to watch. But hey, we can't talk about TV in the 80s at least without talking about VCRs. Now, VCRs were huge in terms of a technical revolution for all of us. It allowed us to buy a movie, watch it in our own home, in our own living room, have the ability to pause the movie, rewind it, watch something over and over again, and then, of course, collect multiple movies. So for many of us, in addition to our tape collection, our album collection, our CD collection, we also had our videotape collections. But another great thing about the VCR was that we could record shows off of TV. Oh my gosh, this was huge. So for example, I was a big General Hospital fan, and when I was in school, I couldn't watch General Hospital because it came on at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So once we figured out how to program the VCR, we could program it to turn on and tape General Hospital at 2 o'clock, and then I could come home from school and watch it later in the afternoon or early that evening and never miss an episode. I also did this in college because I couldn't schedule my classes around what shows I wanted to watch. Well, not 100% anyway. So yeah, watching TV back in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s was much slower. It was much more deliberate. It was much more family-oriented. It was more social. And honestly, it was more magical. And we certainly didn't binge watch. We waited, we anticipated, and we remembered. So let me know in the comments below if these are memories that you share, if your TV viewing experience growing up in the 70s and 80s was similar. I mean, as much as I love to binge watch shows and my attention span has definitely shortened, I really do miss sitting with my family, eating popcorn, watching The Sound of Music, and bonding, just watching a TV show. Those were really magical times. And hey, If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do. I share lots of interesting content reminiscing about the 70s and 80s and anything Gen X related. As always, thank you so much for watching. My name is Noelle, and I will talk to you in the next video.